Good evening. It is the year 1793 and the American Revolution has been over for 10 years. Rebecca Motte is writing down her recollections of the war for her grandchildren who are in London with their parents. Thomas Pickett and Betsy Motte Pickett. Thomas is the American ambassador in Great Britain.
There. I think I have stated it well enough. But perhaps I'd better read it over to make sure that I have stated it all correctly. October 25th, 1793. My dearest children, it has been 10 years since the end of the late war with Great Britain, the war for American independency, and I have been persuaded for some days now that 'twas time to write down my recollections of that war before those recollections become just a blur in my mind. I am sending these recollections to you, my dear ones, who are so far away in London. As it is not for us to know the future, it is possible that I may never see you again, and I want you to be aware of the contributions made by our family to the late war effort, and for you to understand the hardships we faced. Your grandfather Motte and I were patriots from the very beginning, and wholeheartedly supported the protest against the acts of the British Parliament. Indeed, our entire family was pledged to the patriot cause, and when it came time to choose between loyalty to the king and independency, our family, unlike others, knew not a moment's hesitation in supporting independency. The war was late coming to us, as most of the fighting was confined to the north for the first 2 years, and we here in South Carolina were left in relative peace. But that changed in 1778, when France declared war on Great Britain. The focus of the war then shifted to the south. In December of that year, the British arrived in Georgia and captured the city of Savannah, and then moved up the Savannah River to take the outlying towns. Soon it was South Carolina's turn. In the spring, the British began to march up the Carolina coast, burning and looting as they went. Indeed, your father's plantation at Asheville was one of those that was burned. The British Army made it all the way to Charlestown Neck before the arrival of General Lincoln from Georgia caused them to retreat down the coast. There were a lull in the fighting that summer. The summer of 1779. And 'twere during that lull that your father approached your grandfather and me and asked our permission to marry your mother. We were not surprised, for we had known for some time that your father was, shall we say, sweet on our Betsy. But what a time to get married in the middle of a war. And however, we were pleased with the connection and gave them our blessing. 'Twas in the fall that General Lincoln prevailed upon our French allies to help us drive the British from Savannah. That effort was, to say the least, unfortunate. Well, no, it were most unfortunate. It was during that battle, the Second Battle of Savannah, that the family suffered its first loss. Your grandfather's youngest brother, Major Charles Motte of the 2nd Regiment, was killed. It was a grim reminder of the personal cost of war. As the French fleet sailed away from the Georgia coast in October, the British began to arrive in great numbers. In November, 3,000 troops landed in Savannah, and in January, General Clinton arrived with a fleet of upwards of 50 ships. By February, British soldiers had landed on John's Island, just south of Charleston, and by March, the British were encamped on the banks of the Ashley River. It was then that your grandfather and I decided to leave the city and seek safety at Fairfield, our plantation in Santee. You know, my dears, I can never see someone in need without wanting to assist them. Therefore, I invited my widowed niece Bruton and my sister-in-law Mrs. Dart and her 4 children to come with us. Quite naturally, your mother, who was expecting her first child in August, also sought refuge with us at Fairfield. Your father and Uncle Pickney, along with your great-uncle Motte, were with the Continental Army in Charleston, hoping to defend it once again from the British. We were hopeful. After all, we had defended the city twice before, and expectations were high that we would do so again. Sadly, this time we were not successful. By the end of April, Charleston was almost completely surrounded. Governor Rutledge was in Georgetown, where he was trying to gather a counterforce to relieve the city. It was at this point that General Lincoln sent a verbal message to the governor, urging him to send whatever troops he had as quickly as possible. Your father was asked to deliver that message. My dears, he had a most difficult ride, traveling some 60 miles through a countryside heavily patrolled by the enemy. He arrived safely, but the city was surrendered before the relief forces had crossed the Santee. Your father then joined the family at Fairfield. We were all stunned when we heard the news of the surrender of Charleston. We were still recovering from the shock of it when a little over a week later, British troops arrived in Georgetown. They had come to round up Patriot supporters and receive the allegiance of those well affected to the British. It was most likely the Loyalists in the area who told the British where they could find Major Thomas Pickney of the Continental Army and Mr. Jacob Motte, former member of the legislature. That should be the rebel legislature. They came to Fairfield at night, no doubt hoping to catch your father and grandfather unaware. They were only partly successful, however, for your father managed to escape from the house and take refuge in the swamp. They did manage to capture your grandfather, however. They took him off to Georgetown, where they tried every persuasion to convince him to change sides, to take the oath of allegiance to the king and become a loyal British subject once again. It goes without saying that he would not do so, not even to save his property. For you must know, my dear ones, that his refusal to give allegiance to the king meant that all his property was to be confiscated. We, all of us, had to remove from Fairfield, and your grandfather was not allowed to come with us. We decided to remove to Mount Joseph, a plantation that I had inherited from my brother, located on the Congaree River some 80 or 90 miles from Fairfield. I was determined to take with me as many of our possessions as possible and leave little in the house for the British to destroy or plunder. I also had all our horses round up to take with us. It was a great undertaking, my little ones, and I want you to know that we underwent many frights and hardships during that journey, which seemed to take forever. Unfortunately, the hardships did not cease when we reached Mount Joseph. The fevers attacked us early on. 3 of your great Aunt Dart's children and your Aunt Mary, along with many of the slaves, were stricken with it for over 10 days. Then it spread to the rest of us. Your grandfather Motte, who had been detained by the British, had been sent down to James Island. By the middle of July, we had heard from him only once. Fortunately, he was able to join us at Mount Joseph in early September. I had hoped that we would not be bothered by the British at Mount Joseph, but that was not to be. They visited us regularly, taking our provisions, and though I did all in my power to protect them, they impressed most of our horses. Meanwhile, your father was making his way north to join General Washington's army. He had got as far as Hillsborough in North Carolina when he heard that the Continental Congress had appointed General Gates the commander of the Southern Department, and that the general was headed south to Hillsborough. Your father decided to wait there for his arrival. He was one of the first officers to offer his services to General Gates, and the general asked your father to be one of his aides. And that, my dear ones, is how your father came to be at the Battle of Camden in August. During the battle, your father was wounded, as I am sure you are well aware, his left leg shattered by a musket ball. He made it to the rear of the battlefield, where he was lifted into a wagon. Good fortune, however, was smiling on your father that day, for he was found unconscious in that wagon by Captain Mackenzie of the 71st Regiment. Captain Mackenzie recognized your father at once, for they had been schoolmates and friends in England, and your father had helped Captain Mackenzie's brother when he was captured by the French off the Georgia coast earlier in the war. Captain Mackenzie wanted to return the favor and had your father taken into town with the British wounded. Captain Mackenzie soon realized that your father stood in great danger of losing his leg and possibly his life without he received immediate care. He persuaded Colonel Tarleton to send his regimental surgeon to examine him. And your father, thanks to the care he got from the British doctors, kept both his life and his leg. And my dear Thomas, in the midst of all the anxiety your mother and indeed the entire family was suffering over your poor father's situation, you were born, a healthy little baby boy, and I might add, a ray of sunshine in an otherwise darkened sky. We were anxious that your father be allowed to come to us at Mount Joseph to complete his recovery. The town of Camden was full of the sick and the wounded and surrounded by swamps and marshland. It was not a healthy place to be. However, we wanted to make sure that his leg would suffer no harm by his leaving. At last, at the end of September, the doctors pronounced your father's leg strong enough for him to make the journey to Mount Joseph by water. We were overjoyed to have your father with us, but soon after his arrival, the smallpox struck the plantation, and your dear Mama was stricken with it. Indeed, at one time, we feared that we would lose her. Your father's leg did not improve and continued to pain him. It was generally felt that he would do better in Charleston, where he could be attended to by a doctor. In early December, your grandfather Motte left Mount Joseph to travel to Charleston to get permission from the British for your father to remove from Mount Joseph. He was successful, and in early January, Thomas, you and your mother and father left. My dear children, at that point in my life, I had suffered the loss of several members of my family whom I held dear. But I have found that frequent bereavements do not make the ones that follow any easier to bear. When your grandfather left for Charleston in early December, my little Becky was very ill. And in spite of all that I or anyone at Mount Joseph could do, we could not save her. She was but 3 years of age, and I felt her loss most keenly. Soon after her death, I suffered another great loss. Your grandfather Motte died quite unexpectedly, and I was left with an overwhelming feeling of emptiness and sorrow that was beyond the power of words to express. I was struggling to recover from my losses and maintain the family when the British arrived in late January. They had been establishing fortified posts to guard the supply route from Charleston to the interior parts of the state, and indeed, in November, had fortified nearby Belleville Plantation. Now they had decided that Mount Joseph, sitting atop a hill over 200 feet above the Congaree River, was the perfect place for a fort. I was stunned when the British commander, Lieutenant McPherson, appeared at my door and informed me that they were about to appropriate my house and fortify it. I doubt not that he expected us to vacate the house immediately. I had just lost my child and my husband. The British had already driven us from our house in Charleston when they laid siege to the city. They then drove us from our home on the Santee, and now they wanted to drive us out of Mount Joseph, which was the outside of enough. And I told him I would not leave. Lieutenant McPherson, as I recall, was a polite and pleasant young man who I could see took his responsibilities most seriously. However, he did agree to allow us to remain in the house while the fortifications were taking place, and rooms were set aside for our accommodation. I want you to know that I did my duty, as any self-respecting South Carolina lady would have done. There were guests in my house, albeit uninvited guests, but guests nevertheless. And I treated the British as graciously as I could, in spite, I might add, of some most uncomplimentary remarks made by some of the officers about our patriot leaders. Remarks which I ignored. 'Twas toward the end of February when we was made uneasy by the sounds of battle coming from Belleville. The Americans were attacking the fort there. However, they were not successful in taking it, and soon peace, if not quiet, descended on the area. For you must know, my little ones, the construction of a palisade around the house caused much noise and confusion. At the beginning of April, the fortifications at Mount Joseph were complete. The house had been narrowly enclosed with a high log palisade that protected the first 2 floors of the house. On the other side of the palisade was an earthen rampart, 10 to 11 feet wide. And, as if that were not enough, in front of the rampart was a 6-foot deep ditch. The ditch was then guarded with an abattis, a barrier of felled trees with sharpened ends pointing outwards. Indeed, it were a formidable sight. They called it Fort Motte. With the completion of Fort Motte, the British abandoned their fort at Belleville Plantation. Lieutenant McPherson then pointed out to me that the Americans had attacked the fort at Belleville, and now that the fort there had been abandoned, they were very likely to attack Fort Motte next. He thought it advisable, and indeed, he insisted that we leave. I agreed wholeheartedly. A fort under attack by the enemy was no place for women and children. We retired to a farmhouse located on a hill north of the mansion house. I believe in the past it had been used as the overseer's house. About a month later, in the beginning of May, we were surprised one morning to see a detachment of soldiers making their way toward us. To our great relief, we discovered they were American forces, General Francis Marion with part of his militia brigade, and Colonel Lee with a detachment from his Legion of Regulars. They were there to take Fort Motte. General Marion's men camped on the field southeast of the fort, while the general himself and a few of his officers made nearby Belleville Plantation their headquarters. Colonel Lee's men camped around the farmhouse, and I immediately requested that the colonel and his officers make my residence their headquarters. I treated him and his officers as generously as I could, and I dare say they enjoyed my hospitality, as Colonel Lee particularly remarked on the quality of the wines that I served them, praising them as some of the best wines in Europe. As Fort Motte was well fortified, General Marion and Colonel Lee planned to take it by siege, and Patriot forces immediately set to work to dig the siege trenches. They were aided in this undertaking by slaves from the neighboring plantations, and the trench operations progressed at a rapid pace. Then, on the 10th of May, word was brought to the Patriot camp that the British were marching out of Camden, and that the commander, Lord Rawdon, was on his way to the relief of Fort Motte. Indeed, we could see the campfires of the British in the distance. Somehow, no one is quite sure how, the defenders inside Fort Motte had got word of Lord Rawdon's approach. Therefore, when asked to surrender the fort, Lieutenant McPherson declined and vowed to defend it to the end. On the 12th of May, Colonel Lee approached me. I could see by the look on his face that he was greatly distressed. Very gently he explained to me that the British under Lord Rawdon were marching to the relief of the fort and were but 8 and 40 hours away. He and General Marion felt they must take the fort this day or give up the siege. Fort Motte, he added, was the principal British depot and supply outpost on the west side of the Congaree. It was important that it be taken by the Americans. However, he continued, at the current pace of operations, the fort was not going to fall that quickly. Since the British were crammed tightly inside the narrow confines of the fort, he and General Marion had determined that if they could set fire to the house, the British must either surrender or be burned alive. Now I knew why he looked so embarrassed and distressed. It's no easy matter to tell an old widowed lady that her house was to be burned, and that house newly built into the bargain. He need not to have worried. I immediately and cheerfully assured him that the loss of my property was nothing compared with the advancement of the Patriot cause. I then took from the top of an old wardrobe a quiver of African arrows, which when struck burst into flames. The combustible arrows had been a gift from the captain of an East India merchant ship. They were a curiosity that we had brought with us from the mansion house, as my niece Bruton feared they might be destroyed if the fort were attacked. I have since that time used the case which held the arrows as a knitting needle case. You older children must surely remember it, for I always had it about. It was a long bamboo quiver with figures in dark brown carved upon the lighter brown beneath. I gave the arrows to Colonel Lee, and as I understand it, they were discharged from a rifle at the roof of the house. The first 2 did not ignite, but the third one did, and set the roof on fire. When the British rushed onto the roof to put out the fire, they were driven off by shot from the artillery piece commanded by the Americans. Thereupon Lieutenant McPherson immediately surrendered the fort. The flames were then put out and the house was saved, for which I was most grateful. To show my appreciation, I invited the American and British officers to dine with me. Colonel Lee, ever appreciative of good food and drink, called it a sumptuous dinner. The British officers gave their parole after dinner and were sent to Lord Rawdon at Nelson's Ferry the next day. After the fortifications around the house were taken down and the ditches and trenches filled in, General Marion and Colonel Lee led their men off to fight other battles in other places. We remained at Mount Joseph until November. The British had been driven out of Georgetown during the summer and were now confined to Charleston and the surrounding countryside. I deemed it safe enough for us to return to Santee. Once we were settled at Fairfield, I began to supply the militia under General Marion with provisions and whatever supplies I had available. I made a point of sending 1 or 2 of my female slaves into Charleston from time to time to gather information about the British. I then passed that information on to General Marion's men. When the British evacuated Charleston in December of 1782, it was a great victory for all of us. Not just the soldiers who fought so bravely, but for all who contributed to the victory. Those that provided grain, beef, and fodder, donated boats, wagons, and workers, or who passed information on to our military leaders. It was indeed a common victory. After the war was over, I was given great praise for being willing to sacrifice my house for the patriot cause. In truth, my dear ones, I have always felt that too much was made over a thing any American woman would have done. I know that some of you, my little ones, are too young to understand what I have written. It is my hope that you will save this letter and read it again when you are older. There. I think that covers the matter well enough. I shall conclude. Please be assured that I am, with the tenderest regard, your most affectionate parent, R. Motte. There. It is done. I shall leave it for now and make copies of it after dinner. Thank you very much. Do any of you have questions you would like to ask?
Where was
Yes.
Fairfield?
Fairfield is on the Santee River. It's about, if you know where Hampton Plantation is, it's located about 3 miles away. Yes.
When you had dinner with the British and Americans, was that in the house or was that in the farmhouse?
It was outside the farmhouse. We could not fit everyone inside, so we ate out. Yes. Al fresco. Anyone else have a question? Yes.
Is Fairfield still in the Pickett family?
I don't think so. I'm not sure if it's still standing or if it's in, is it still? I mean, does anyone,
Ruins.
pardon me?
There are some ruins there. It's an elevated cottage and the brickwork is underneath. It's a jungle and it's not publicly accessible. And it's owned by the federal authorities, I believe. It's like a wildlife refuge area.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
There's a Tory named Motte over on the Savannah River. He was in charge of guarding, I believe, at Hudson's Ferry during the summer of '79. Any relation, any knowledge of who that
Jacob Mott had 2 brothers, one Isaac Mott and then Charles Mott, and Charles was killed at Savannah. But he had a stepmother. His father married after the death of his first wife and had 2 sons by her. They would have been born, the oldest one I think was born in 1764. That probably would make him old enough to be. Those are the only Motts that I know of, but it could be someone who is really not related.
Yeah, it's just some mystery guy.
Yeah, some. Okay, anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much.